ancient civilization, the Babylonians. A name we hear a lot, but perhaps a civilization we actually know almost nothing about. So, who were these Babylonians? The people who showed endless devotion to their god Marduk, who built the mysterious Tower of Babel and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. If you're curious, then let's take a closer look at where they came from, why they are called Babylonians, why the city of Babylon was so important, the laws they set down, their magnificent architecture, their gods, their creation myths. In other words, Babylonian mythology and culture. Where does the name Babylon come from? And where was the city? Let's first look at where the name Babylon comes from, and where the city itself was located. The name of the city of Babylon is first attested in Akkadian inscriptions dating to the late 3rd millennium BCE. However, it is thought that the foundation of the city goes back much further, because its earliest known name in Sumerian was Kadingir-Ra. In Sumerian, Ka means gate, Dingir means god, and Ra is a grammatical ending, so the city was originally named the Gate of the God by the Sumerians. Much later, Sargon of Akkad, who destroyed the Sumerian city-states and founded the Akkadian Empire, captured and demolished the city of Kadingir-Ra. Afterwards, he founded a new city near his own capital of Akkad, and, using the Akkadian translation of the old Sumerian name, called it Bab-Ilim, or, as we know it, Babylon. The name Babylon is derived from the Akkadian words Bab, gate, and Il-E, God, meaning gate of the god. In Hebrew it appears as Babel or Bavel, in Persian as Babur, and in ancient Greek as Babylon. Babylon is the name given to the great city built on both banks of the Euphrates River, on about 1,000 hectares of land near today's town of Hilla, around 88 kilometers south of Baghdad in modern Iraq. But the people who lived there, the ones we call Babylonians, are actually descended from the Akkadians, and, further back, from the Sumerians. So why aren't the people living there called Akkadians or Sumerians? Because Babylon became, one after another, the capital of many dynasties and empires. Because rulers like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II, whom we will talk about in detail, turned Babylon into the most important city of Mesopotamia. And because they developed their own religion and pantheon, which we refer to as Babylonian mythology. For all these reasons, we call the people who lived there Babylonians. Why was Babylon such an important city? According to the historian Herodotus, Babylon could be entered through 8 great gates. Inside, there were more than 50 temples, 2 palaces, streets that crossed at right angles, and avenues opening onto large squares. The temples and palaces contained statues, tables, and various objects made of solid gold. It was one of the largest cities of the ancient world, and the wide bridge built on stone piers connected the 2 banks of the Euphrates. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, considered one of the 7 wonders of the world, are also mentioned in Herodotus's histories. Babylon occupies an important place in history for many reasons. For example, according to the Hebrew Bible, it is one of the 4 great cities of the kingdom founded by Nimrod, grandson of Noah, after the flood. In the Quran, it is said that the angels Harut and Marut, who taught magic to people, were in Babylon. In Zoroastrianism, they appear as Harvatat and Ameratat. In Judaism as Harut and Marut, in Hinduism as Maruts. Some Islamic commentaries and legends say that these 2 angels were hung upside down and bound in a well in Babylon. Throughout history, Babylon was known as the most important center of astronomy, astrology, and divination in Mesopotamia. Especially in the time of the Chaldeans and later periods, it also became famous as a center of magic and sorcery. The the Tower of Babel. The most important structure that made Babylon famous was, without doubt, the Tower of Babel. This tower is mentioned in many sources, including religious scriptures. Historically, it is thought that the Tower of Babel existed since the Sumerian period, when the city was called Kadingir-Ra, and that it was built or enlarged by Nimrod. In the Bible, it is referred to as a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. In the Quran, a tall tower made of baked bricks and clay appears in a story that mentions Pharaoh, Haman, Korah, and Moses. But this structure is said to be built by the Egyptian pharaoh in Moses' time. The verse can be summarized as, Pharaoh said, O Haman, build me a high tower that I may reach the ways of the heavens, and look upon the God of Moses. Whether this tower is the same as the Tower of Babel, or a completely different structure, is not definitively known. The Tower of Babel is thought to have stood on a square base of 91 by 91 meters, and to have been about 75 meters tall, consisting of 6 receding levels. On top of these 6 stories, there was said to be a 7th story that no one could enter, bringing the total height to about 91 meters. According to the legends, this topmost chamber was the holy room of the chief god Marduk, and here was located the gate of the god from which the city took its name, Babylon. Herodotus, in his histories, describes the tower as a temple and says that it had 8 levels, not 7, and that one could ascend to the higher levels by spiral staircases on the outside. He writes that on the top level there was a bed covered with rich fabrics and a golden table beside it, and that no mortal was allowed to stay in this room overnight. The room was reserved for a woman chosen by the Babylonian god himself. It was believed that the god would come and lie on that bed. However, Herodotus clearly adds that these were things the local priests told him and that he did not believe them, saying something like, "If one is to believe the priests, which I do not." States that ruled over Babylon. An important question is, which states were founded on the territory of Babylon? The rule of the Babylonians begins in 1894 BCE with what we call the First Babylonian Dynasty, founded by an Amorite clan, the Amorites, Amuru. After them came the Kassites, the Assyrians, and the Chaldeans, all of whom played important roles in the region's history. In 539 BCE, with the capture of Babylon by the Achaemenid Persians, the political rule of the people we call Babylonians effectively ended. Within this long historical period, there are 2 especially important eras. The Amorite period under King Hammurabi, the greatest ruler of the Babylonians, famous for his laws. The Neo-Babylonian Chaldean period under Nebuchadnezzar II, when Babylon reached its peak of splendor, with large building projects and, according to later tradition, the construction of the Hanging Gardens mentioned by Herodotus. We will examine the periods of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar in detail. For now, let's take a closer look at the First Babylonian dynasty and its greatest king, Hammurabi. The First Babylonian Dynasty and Hammurabi. In 1894 BCE, an Amorite chieftain named Sumu-Abum seized a territory that included the then relatively small city of Babylon. His goal was to create a kingdom out of the many small city-states and minor kingdoms in the area. Although Sumu-Abum never actually used the title King of Babylon for himself in the surviving records, he is considered the founder of the First Babylonian dynasty. After him came Sin-Muballit, who is recognized as the first Amorite ruler to be officially titled King of Babylon. Sin-Muballit was the father of the person who would become Babylon's most important king and raise the dynasty to imperial status, Hammurabi. As the 6th Amorite king, Hammurabi ascended the throne of Babylon in 1792 BCE. If we look at the neighboring states at the time, to the north were the Assyrians. To the southeast was the ancient and powerful kingdom of Elam, whose history goes back to around 4000 BCE. Elam was strong enough to intervene in the internal affairs of other states. To the east was the kingdom of Eshnunna, which controlled the crossings of the Tigris. To the south was the kingdom of Larsa. Sin Muballit had formed alliances with smaller city-states and defeated the king of Larsa in battle, causing tension between Larsa and Babylon. Surrounded by such powerful and well-established states, Hammurabi's room to maneuver was very narrow. In fact, the campaigns he undertook to expand his borders did not start immediately, but only after he had already ruled for about 30 years. The first major campaign was not even for the sake of expansion, but for self-defense. The most powerful state in the region, Elam, decided to launch a military expedition into Mesopotamia to gain new territories. Upon hearing this, Hammurabi formed a coalition with various large and small powers in Mesopotamia and managed to defeat this ancient kingdom. This victory increased Hammurabi's political authority and made him a leader feared and respected across the region. After this first campaign, Babylonian forces began to advance to the southeast and, in the future, would move to control the northern regions as well as the basin of the Persian Gulf. By around 1755 BCE, Hammurabi had created a large political unity in Mesopotamia. Under his control now lay important trade routes and valuable resources such as silver, copper, and lapis lazuli, all of which brought immense wealth to Babylon. Hammurabi expanded his realm systematically, conquering cities such as Larsa, Eshnunna, Kish, Lagash, Nippur, Borsippa, Ur, Uruk, Umma, Adab, and Sippar, pushing the Elamites completely out of the south and bringing many Assyrian territories in the north under his control. The Code of Hammurabi. One of the main reasons Hammurabi is so famous is that he compiled a law code consisting of 282 articles. There had been earlier Sumerian and Akkadian laws, but they were not as extensive or systematic as the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi drew on these earlier laws, edited them, and supplemented them with new provisions suited to the needs of his time. The fact that many copies of the code survive shows how widely it was applied. The Code of Hammurabi consists of a prologue, an epilogue, and 282 legal provisions. Its comprehensive nature is its most striking feature. In the prologue, Hammurabi speaks at length of the chief god Marduk and explains how and why he was chosen as king by Marduk and Shamash, the god of justice. He claims that he brought justice, truth, peace, and prosperity to the land. In the epilogue, he again emphasizes these points, adding that the laws prevent the rich from oppressing the poor and the strong from crushing the weak. He advises future kings and people to obey this law code and implies that those who violate it will be cursed. The 282 articles can be roughly grouped as follows. Articles 1 to 5, Procedural Law. These include penalties for sorcery, assault, crimes punishable by death, and unjust judgments by judges. Articles 6 to 25, Property and Ownership Rights. Articles 26 to 41, Military Regulations and the Protection of Soldiers' Property and Family. Articles 42 to 65, Agriculture, Animal Husbandry, and Rules concerning farmers. The most famous copy of the code is carved onto a stone stele now in the Louvre Museum. Although most of the laws have survived, some parts are worn away. Articles 65 to 100 are partly missing, but from context we understand that they concerned prices of goods and services. Articles 100 to 112, the rights and responsibilities of merchants, and rules about tavern keepers, often women. Articles 113 to 126. Debt and related issues. Repayment, family members being taken as hostages for debt, and how they could be redeemed. Articles 127 to 195. The longest section, covering marriage, marital property, divorce, transfer of property, relationships between in-laws, inheritance, marriage to slaves, widows, adoption, and children. Articles 196 to 214. Injuries and bodily harm. Lex talionis, retaliation, is applied between people of the same social rank. For example, if someone of the upper class cuts off another upper-class person's arm, his own arm is cut off. But if a member of the upper class injures someone of lower status, he usually pays a fine, instead of suffering the same physical punishment. Articles 215 to 277. Fees, responsibilities, and standards for various professions and services. Articles 278 to 282. Slave sales, including a rather striking rule that the buyer has a 1-month warranty period for the slave. The fall of the First Babylonian Dynasty. So how did the First Babylonian Dynasty collapse, and what happened next? After Hammurabi's death, the Babylonian state rapidly declined and began to lose the territories it had conquered. Within a relatively short time, the Amorite dynasty shrank back to something closer to a small city-state, as it had been at the beginning. Then the Hittites arrived in Mesopotamia. First they conquered Aleppo, and then they invaded Babylon, plundering it. After this, they withdrew, but they had allied themselves with the Kassites, a people whose origins are still not entirely clear. The Hittites enabled a Kassite dynasty to take power in Babylon. The Kassites ended up ruling Babylon longer than any other dynasty. Their kingdom, founded around 1595 BCE, lasted until about 1155 BCE. However, under Kassite rule, Babylon did not regain its former greatness. It remained overshadowed by the Hittites and the Assyrians and gradually lost territory. Because of continuous military weakness and shrinking borders, the Kassite dynasty was overthrown by the Elamites around 1155 BCE. Babylon remained under Elamite control for a while, until Nebuchadnezzar I drove the Elamites out and returned power to the local population. Yet local rule did not last long either. Soon, Aramean tribes advancing from the northwest invaded Babylon and plunged the region into chaos. In 911 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was founded, and Babylon fell under Assyrian control for about 300 years. When one of the Assyrian kings tried to make Babylon the capital of the empire, rebellions broke out, and the Assyrians increasingly struggled with civil wars. The Neo-Babylonian Chaldean Empire. Now, let's come to the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Chaldeans, who lived in the extreme southeastern part of Mesopotamia, felt oppressed by Assyrian rule. At the same time, if we look at the wider region, we see that Egypt was a significant threat to Mesopotamia from the southwest, while the Medes were a powerful military force to the east. The Assyrian Empire, although still militarily strong and politically unified, was worn down by internal strife. Babylon itself was governed by Assyrian-appointed governors. At this point, the Chaldean leader Nabopolassar rose in revolt against Assyria, allied himself with the Median army, and marched against the Assyrians. He advanced as far as Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and sacked the city. By doing this, Nabopolassar effectively freed Babylon. After his death, his son Nebuchadnezzar II came to the throne in 604 BCE and the state evolved into what we now call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or Chaldean Empire. For the first 10 years of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar II waged war mainly to drive the Egyptians out of the Mesopotamian sphere of influence. These struggles brought him control over Jerusalem. At that time, Jerusalem was inhabited by the Jews. After conquering the city, Nebuchadnezzar exiled King Jehoiakim of Judah to Babylon and placed him under control. Rather than abolishing the kingdom entirely at first, Nebuchadnezzar set up a new king, Jehoiakim, as his vassal. However, over the next 11 years, the Jews repeatedly rebelled. As a result, Nebuchadnezzar carried out large-scale deportations and brutal massacres in Jerusalem. The Temple of Solomon was stripped of its treasures, and the remaining objects were destroyed. Skilled craftsmen and blacksmiths who were useful to him were taken into exile in Babylon. Only the poorest people were left behind. When a king he appointed later also rebelled in his 9th year, Nebuchadnezzar abolished the kingdom of Judah entirely in 587 BCE and turned Jerusalem into a province of his empire. The deportations from Judah both weakened the kingdom and provided Nebuchadnezzar with a highly skilled workforce. With this labor, he embarked on grand architectural projects: the rebuilding of the Tower of Babel, the construction of the Hanging Gardens, and the monumental Ishtar Gate. He also gave Jewish children Babylonian names, dressed them like Babylonians, and had them educated in Babylonian culture, a policy whose traces are visible even today in the biblical narratives. It is said that Nebuchadnezzar had the Hanging Gardens built for his wife Amytis. These gardens, constructed of mud brick terraces filled with earth, supported a variety of trees, shrubs, and vines that rose tier upon tier, forming an impressive feat of engineering. However, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world whose exact location has never been definitively identified. The end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So, what happened to the Chaldean Empire, which reached its height under Nebuchadnezzar II? The kingdom, founded in 626 BCE, grew into a Babylonian empire, especially under his reign. But it did not last long. In nearby Persis, Fars, a man named Cyrus, later known as Cyrus the Great, was born. In 559 BCE, he succeeded to the throne of the Persian city-state of Anshan. By 549 BCE, he had conquered the Medes and founded the Achaemenid Empire, the first great Persian empire. After overthrowing the Median Empire and then defeating the Kingdom of Lydia, Cyrus turned his attention to his final target, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In 539 BCE, Cyrus fought the Babylonians near Opis, north of Babylon, and won. The Babylonian king Nabonidus fled the battle, and Cyrus captured the city without heavy resistance. When he entered Babylon, Cyrus proclaimed that Nabonidus had betrayed the god Marduk, and that Marduk had sent him to Babylon as a savior. In this way, he ended both the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the rule of the Babylonians, which had begun back in 1894 BCE. From that point on, Babylon became a Persian city. Later, in 333 BCE, Alexander the Great captured Babylon for the Greeks, and in 323 BCE he died in that very city. The Babylonians were so devoted to their chief god Marduk and to their pantheon that Cyrus's claim to be sent by Marduk as a savior was enough to prevent any serious resistance.